Hello everyone. I'm Francis Seeley from M4 Voices and GlobalNet 21, and this is one of our regular interviews. We normally do them on Wednesday mornings, but today we're doing them in the evening. So I hope quite a few of you will be able to join in and watch us. In our interviews, we interview a whole series of different people who are trying to make a difference in their community, involved in politics or civil society action or all sorts of different activities. But we're also interested in people who are local authors. We're interested in books. We're interested in reviews. And today we're doing just that. We're actually going to interview a local author. And his name's Stephen Cox, and you're going to see him in a minute. And Stephen is someone who lives locally and who has just published a book called Our Child of the Stars. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Anyhow, thank you, Stephen, for joining us. Before I come to you, let me say if there's anybody watching on the webinar site, please chat in any comments or questions on the chat box on your right, or if you're watching on Facebook, put your comments in under the video frame in the comments section of Facebook. Anyhow, Stephen, welcome to this webinar.
Thank you.
And, thank you for joining us. I mean, can I ask you, you've written this book that I mentioned, Our Child of the Stars, and we'll come to that. But first of all, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Well, although I was born in America, I came to Bristol when I was 2 years old, and I've lived all over the south of England, and I'm been living in London since 1997. I work in communications. So for 12 years, I worked for Great Ormond Street Hospital. I ran their communications department. And so I've got, I've always been interested in books. I've always been interested in what goes on in the world. I've been interested in people. And so all those things flow into the book, really.
Okay, so you've written the book, but tell me, have you always been a writer, and how did you get into writing in the first place?
Well, I think, firstly, I've always wanted to be a writer, but wanting to be a writer doesn't get you very far. You actually have to do it. I've always been very, very bookish. I remember going to the library and taking out 5 books a week once I was old enough to walk to the library on my own. I've experimented with writing short stories and poetry over the years, but I was lucky enough to go on sabbatical in 2012, and I sat down to write something I'd been thinking about, and that turned into a novel. Not a novel that's been successful, that's got any sort of publication. But that was showed me that I was interested in writing to that length and that complexity. And while I was working on that, I had a side project, which was Our Child of the Stars. And it's, I got the bug, really. I had thought vaguely about writing a novel, but not done anything about it for about 20 years, I suppose. So this is getting a childhood dream. It's quite a long way from childhood, really.
I mean, if you're an aspiring young writer, as you were, I mean, what advice would you give? How do you get into writing? I mean, is it something you can do sporadically, or do you have to have a discipline? I mean, what's the process of writing?
Well, there are two sides to that. The first thing is that if you want to get into writing, you should write. You should experiment. You should experiment with form. You should read a lot, see what you like, what you don't like. Once you set down to write a particular project, yes, you do need discipline. A lot of people try and write every day, or have a routine that the weekends are given over to writing, something that enables you to keep at it, keep practicing, keep better. And obviously, if you're writing something long like a novel, you have to do that over a lengthy period of time. Exactly what discipline works for you is going to vary from person to person. But I think if somebody's thinking about becoming a writer, they should actually, start by writing and seeing what, and in time showing it to other people and getting valid criticism and so forth. Because actually just simply hanging around vaguely thinking you'll do it one day won't get you anywhere.
So it's a bit like keeping fit. You can't do it one day and then leave it. You've got to continue, and you've got to have that discipline. I mean, does it help to work with other writers and to be in a writing group as well? I gather you belong to the Green Writers Group, or is it the Green Bookshop Writers Group? I mean, did that help you? And is that something you would recommend to other writers, to get involved with that community, to get some sort of self-help?
There are a whole series of things that a good writing group will do for you, and you can do some of this online. Firstly, writing is quite odd. I mean, you go and sit with your laptop and make things up for a year at a time. So actually, it's good to get out and talk to other people who face similar problems. So the friendship you can make in the group is important. You also eventually are going to have to show your work to somebody. If you want to publish it, or if you want to know if it's any good, you have to show it to other people. And not only do the group help you by giving you feedback, but they also help you understand how variable people's responses are to what you write. And you have to get a sort of curious combination of being able to assimilate and understand the criticism and so what of it is valid and what of it isn't. So a good group will help you in terms of your craft. A good group will help you in terms of dealing with a slightly odd aspect of it being such a solitary process. And also there are places where you could, the group I went to, the Big Green Bookshop writing group, which is currently homeless because that bookshop has closed, but it's still running. There's something about encouraging you to push yourself and to find out about the industry and to be, go to networking events and so forth, and being able to do that with other people who you know already is really helpful in just getting to grips with the industry and how you would go about getting a book published if that's what you wanted. I mean, writing groups do vary. I mean, some of them are better than others, but any writing group ought to be encouraging you to write, which is of itself a good thing.
And when you actually write, do you write to a plan? Do you know what the end is going to be? Or do you start writing not knowing what the end is going to be and you make it up as you go along?
So there's a great debate about this within writing, and the quick answer is different writers do it in different ways. What I like to do is to be very clear who the main characters are, where they start in the book, where they finish up in the book, and the sort of things that are going to stop them getting what they want, what the challenges are. So I start with a plan, but it's not a chapter by chapter plan. It's not a scene by scene plan, but it's a bit more than a back of an envelope. It's about a side of A4. And I start writing on that. And then I refine the plan as I write the book, and I flip between planning and writing. There are people, Stephen King is one, who sit down and write the book and don't have a plan at all. And there are people who plot it out much more than I do. So I sit somewhere in the middle.
And when you write, do you write for yourself or do you write to get published?
So I started my first novel I wrote because I wanted to write it, and I thought it was quite good. It probably isn't good enough to get published. Now I am writing, I have a book out, I have a sequel to that book that I need to write. The being published thing is in the back of my head. But I think you have to write something that you believe in. You have to write something that's true to your vision for the book. And I have a sort of archetypal reader in mind, who's probably my sister-in-law, I think, because I'm very close to her in terms of my interests. But there's no doubt that if you want to get published, you have to at least think about what that involves. But on the other hand, there's no point writing something you don't want to write because you think it'll be published, because people can probably spot that.
But of course, as you said, you would like to get it published. So how do you go about doing that? I mean, what advice would you give? I mean, is yours published through a main book company, or do you self-publish? What advice would you give? Do you go, which avenue do you go down?
So broadly, there are three main ways you can get published. You can go to a traditional commercial publisher, which normally means you have to approach them through an agent, though some of the smaller ones take submissions directly. You can publish it yourself, which can be a very good way of doing it. And there's actually now a crowd-funded option where effectively you get people to pay for you to produce the book. And they all have pros and cons. I wanted to try for traditional publishing because, fairly or not, it has a cachet to it. And a lot of people assume that self-publishing is because it's not very good. And also because I wanted to spend time writing and not have to worry about, finding a good cover designer and things like that. And people do self-publish that I know who are very good at it, and they invest in it. They produce a high quality product. So it's not that there's inherently anything wrong in self-publishing. The problem you get is there's a long tail of books that have been published that aren't aren't properly proofread, or very, very weak, as most people would read them and say they're very weakly written. So that is a problem, but there are people who write very good books and self-publish. So I made a conscious choice, and of course you can choose to be traditionally published only if you get somebody to do it. So I got an agent, and I got an agent by writing to agents in the way that you're supposed to, and one of them liked the book enough that he took me on and represented me. And then he worked with me on the book because it needed some planning, it needed some honing down. And then the agent does the hard work of actually selling the book, and he got a publisher interested, and that was that's the sort of traditional route, and it worked for me.
Okay, so it worked for you. You got your book published. It's called Our Child of the Stars. What was the inspiration behind that book in the first place? I mean, I think it began in 2013 as a short story, didn't it?
Yes. So I actually was reading Ray Bradbury, who's a writer I like, who writes stuff that's a bit nostalgic and a bit strange stuff happens in the shadows, and it's quite charming. And I thought I'd write a short story based a bit on that. And then all sorts of things came together. So in one sense, the inspiration for the book, because it's a book about a couple who adopt a child who's very different, was my own experience being a parent, and how being a parent changes everything. Everyone tells you what it's like to be a parent, but actually living through it is different. All sorts of other things started to flow into it. So I think that the initial inspiration, the story that came out in that sort of week I wrote it, had the main three characters, and I started to see, where had they come from, where were they going to, and I started to get a sense that there was a whole book in it, which was quite exciting, really.
And why did you choose science fiction as your sort of genre of writing?
I think that the most important thing to say about the book is I spent a lot of time and effort trying to make it as accessible as possible. So, for example, it's a book which lots of people who don't read science fiction have enjoyed. I've read science fiction on and off since I was about 10. I think that all fiction uses metaphor, and science fiction is just doing that in a different way. And I think it allows you can in some ways cast a more penetrating mirror on the way things really are by using a bit of sleight of hand and bringing other things in. So science fiction is normally talking about the current day, whatever else it pretends it's talking about. And in the same way, I thought it's quite interesting that because it's set in the 1960s, the more I wrote it, the more it seemed not to be talking about the 1960s at all. It seems to be talking about our current day and the problems we face socially and politically and so forth. It came as a jeu d'esprit, it came as a nice idea for a short story, but there's lots of other things you're able to do with it. And I think what's been quite interesting about the whole genre question is the science fiction world has broadly said, this is a science fiction novel that has chosen to put a lot of emphasis on the character and the relationships of the people in it. And broadly, we think that's good, or at least a perfectly valid choice to make for a science fiction book. And quite a lot of people who never read science fiction who read it think it's really good. So I've succeeded in broadening my audience, which is what I wanted.
Okay, and you mentioned you chose 1960s as the decade, the environment for the book. Was there any reason for that? I mean, the 1960s was a decade that was tumultuous. There was a lot of conflict. There was a lot of violence. But like today, in some respects, did you sort of see those two, epochs having similarities?
Yes, and the more I wrote in the 1960s, the more the similarities became obvious. I mean, it's easy to be nostalgic about the dress and the way people dress and sense of freedom and all the social movements that we somewhat take for granted and all the successes that they had. There was also a big downside to the 60s. There was a long, bloody and ultimately unwinnable war in Vietnam. And I have to say, when you're writing about a dishonest president fighting wars overseas that they can't actually win for very dubious reasons, I mean, obviously that also seems to speak to our present day as well. So I think that there was a very strong sense for me that although it was set in the 60s and, I enjoyed playing with the nostalgia and the fact there were payphones, you had to put coins in and things like that. It is talking about things that people can relate to now. It's talking about the problems you have being a parent, and yet they're talking about the big global issues.
And when you actually wrote it, I mean, you mentioned you know some of the things about why you wrote it, but did you write it just because you wanted to tell a story, or did you have a specific message you wanted to get across? I think
Yeah.
you mentioned once that you wanted to get a message across about conquering suspicion.
Sorry, conquering.
Suspicion.
Um, yeah, well, that's one way of putting about it. I mean, I think if you sit down and say, I am going to write a book to lecture people about something, that doesn't tend to produce very good books. So when I was a kid, I used to read the C.S. Lewis books, the Narnia books, and I could spot when he got on his high horse and started lecturing me, even as an 8 or 10-year-old. I wanted to write a story that was entertaining and had a plot and characters you were interested in and made you care about the people. And at the end of the day, it ends in a position which is resolute, interesting. And yes, I mean, one of the things about some of the issues that are brought up is that I do try and show both sides of the issues. So the main antagonist, for example, you may not like him very much. He's not written to be likable. You may not agree with him, but at least you know why he's doing what he's doing. And you also see he's a complicated, messy human being like we all are. So I think that it is about trying to see the good in people, which is often very difficult. And a part of that is that the couple, Jean and Molly, actually end up relying on some people who are quite different from them in terms of their politics and their religion and their, you know, people who you would naturally assume would not be on their side. So it's partly about trying to look for good in people. But I think I wouldn't want people to think it's a preachy book, because I think that I think preachy books are generally quite poor.
Yeah, I understand that, and I probably would agree with that. But you say it's about two people, Molly and Jean, and their relationship in the 1960s. And what happens, I believe, is they live in this frenetic world, and tragedy strikes them when a meteor crashes into a New England town, and they find a small boy called Cory, who they adopt. And is that the sort of basis of your story?
Yes, I mean, that's the tagline is it's about a couple who adopt an alien, because it's fairly obvious that's what he is. And they have to keep him secret from the government because the government's very interested in him. They have to pretend he's dead and keep him secret. And that's a story that has resonances from all sorts of traditions, all sorts of places. It works because of the characters work. It works because I'm very interested in, having worked at Great Ormond Street, the way that people can judge by appearances, and Cory does look very, very odd, although, you know, he's capable of communicating. He's very likable and very engaging and very interested in the earth. But you know, there's a thing about, we judge worth by how people look, and we don't like people who look different from us, and all those sort of things that I wanted to explore. And also, as I say, one of the things I wanted to explore is the way that having children allows you to relive things like Christmas and Halloween that you've probably stopped being interested in. But there's more to that, because Cory has come in chaos and disaster. Why is he there? What else is going on behind it? So that sort of big filmic plot is going on as well. But it's a yes, I mean, it's trying to be both, and I'd submit most people seem to think it is. It's trying to be a family drama about the dynamics of doing that, and also tackle some of the other issues as well.
So is it the fact that Cory's an alien, and it's about how you try and get a relationship with the unknown and engage with the unknown and have trust in the unknown, and also find that there's a lot of people who don't have that trust and who actually want to destroy something which is a mystery to them?
There's partly that, and there's partly this thing about using people as things. You know, that there are people who want to find Cory with no intention of doing him any harm. They want to use him in the battle between the USSR and the USA. They think he gives them, you know, understanding him and his technology will help them in the Cold War. They want to be sure that any scientific advances are to their benefit. There are people who want him because it will advance their career. The officialdom don't want to kill him, or even for him to harm him, but they do want to use him. and Molly and Jean don't want to use him, they want to love him. So that's one of the things underneath it. And it does, I mean, I get to show a town that's suffered a catastrophe, putting itself back together, and it is a time of great division, great social division. People forget that one of the things that happened in the 60s was that Richard Nixon got elected and then subsequently re-elected. There was a lot of concern about how fast things were going and whether people were losing control and so forth. And I try and be sympathetic to both sides of that argument.
So it's a sort of, in a way, it's an allegorical tale about a terrifying decade, a tragic incident, and the reaction to that is either fear or love.
Well, I mean, we all have complicated things, don't we? I think there are people's character comes out in conditions of great stress, and we get to understand Molly enough to know that she does something that's pretty weird, was pretty extreme, which is to basically save this child and keep him away from the authorities. But people are put in that situation and have to do some very extreme things. And it shows that it's not brilliant for them, because they start to look, the adults start to look around the corner. They don't know whether to trust everybody anymore, and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot in it. I mean, it deals with a lot of issues. It deals with bereavement. It deals with war and peace. It deals with can you trust the government to protect the rights of the individual, but in a story, which I think I probably laboured the point, that it's not a sermon.
Yeah, I think I read in one review that in a way you're trying to highlight the dark side of life, whilst at the same time showing that can be confronted by both hope and humour.
Yeah, I think hope is really important. I mean, we've talked about why write a book in these current times, and I think one of the things that lots of people take from it is that it's a work which does give us hope that human beings can be decent, that we can work together to solve our problems. It doesn't do that in a slushy way, but it does remind us that sometimes we are able to transcend our initial suspicions of each other and so forth. And I think there's a tendency for a lot of literature at the moment to be one of two things, one of which is incredibly grim. So there's a lot of science fiction and fantasy in which everybody is rotten, lots of people die, there's very little hope or love or anything in it, and that's very much. Game of Thrones is probably the best known example. Now, that's a taste. If people want to read that sort of stuff, then obviously they should be free to do so. And the other side of it is stuff which I would say is completely escapist, where nothing horrible happens, where everything is stitched up, where it's all hearts and flowers. And I think that's, again, if somebody wants to read that, they should. But I think I wanted to write a book that actually talks about how things actually are, in terms of the horrible things that happen, the unfair things that happen, but actually also gave us hope, because that's, I think, where we need to be. Because there's no doubt in my mind that all the problems we face, if we lose hope, we're not going to get anything. Hope is what gives us energy to do something about them.
Which makes me ask, I gather you're a Quaker, and has that faith, I mean, what you just said now is interesting in relation to that, but has that faith, your Quaker faith, affected the way you wrote that book?
I think that a couple of people asked me, so is this going to be a Quaker book? Is it going to be about Quakers? And I thought that was not particularly interesting. I think that Quakers talk about trying to see that of good, or some people say that of God in everyone. However bad somebody is, you do at least acknowledge the possibility of redemption and change. So that's very much in the book. Most people say, most Quakers who've read it say, this book is very Quaker, even though it never uses the word, and nobody in the book is a Quaker. Well, one very minor character is a Quaker, but you have to guess that. It doesn't say that. I mean, I think you bring your worldview to a book, and your book will tell you something about your worldview. And there's a certain amount of discussion of Jean and Molly have both abandoned their religion and are, in Jean's case, very happy without that, and in Molly's case, she occasionally has, vague hankerings. But that's not a setup for her to become a Quaker in the second book or anything. I think you always bring your. I think the quick answer to your question is yes. I understood as I wrote the book that it was starting to speak to some of the Quaker values, but it was never set out to be a sermon.
Okay, well, you're going to read an extract in a sec, but before you do, if people want to get the book, where do they get it, or how do they get in touch with you?
Right. Well, the quick answer is Waterstones in Enfield stock it. It's available through all normal bookshops, and if they don't actually have it when you go in, pretty much any sensible bookshop can order it. I have a website which is stephencox.co.uk, and people can contact me via that if they want to. But broadly, it's in Enfield Library and it's in Enfield Waterstones, so it's not a difficult book to get hold of.
Okay, well, you're going to read an extract now, but Jo Cowley-Smith has written that she's read the book already and she thoroughly enjoyed it. She said, my young daughter is reading it now and she's enjoying it too. It's easy to read and it will appeal to everyone. So she said, thank you for doing it. Anyhow, if you'd like to do the extract, and then we'll finish the webinar when you finish the extract. It's only going to be about 5 minutes. So before you start, let me say thank you for doing this, Stephen. It's been a great interview, and I wish your book every success, because clearly it's a book which is going to be interesting to a lot of people. So thank you. And let's hear your extract now.
Thank you very much. So what I don't want to give a lot of context, but this is basically the scene in which Jean and Molly are courting. And it gives you, the book opens in the middle of the situation where they're hiding the child Cory, and then I flip back and explain how they've got there. So to do that, I write about their courtship. Winter held Amber Grove in talons of ice, sketching fairy wings on every tree. Molly and Jean came out of the cinema where she'd sniggered through the space film he'd chosen. His feelings be damned. He'd snorted and sighed. Cold air burned her throat now, but his familiar arm was warm around her shoulders. I've seen kids in the road make up a better story than that, she said, smiling. Okay, sorry, that was garbage. Let's go skating, Jean said. They walked the length of Main Street, past City Hall, past shops closed for the evening, and one heaving bar until they came to the park. The pond had frozen deep and solid, and many people had thought of skating too. They queued to hire the skates and the wooden hut that sold ice creams in summer. They'd been Jean and Molly for 6 months. They'd first met in a basement, painting signs for the demonstration. Jean, walking into a room of people, moved like he just rented his body and didn't quite have the hang of it. He was handsome, though. His faded clothes were behind the times, and he looked away when their eyes met. But throughout that evening, she'd often seen him gazing at her. Maybe he thought that her mouth was too wide. Maybe he'd spotted her only vanity, the popular bottle which kept her hair the golden blonde she had been at 5. They lived under the shadow of the bomb, but they believed that the times were a-changing. Jean and Molly hitched across the state to hear the singers and bands they both loved, whose music was not just beautiful but meant something profound. They'd marched against unjust laws, against the vicious, stupid war and the draft that fed it, against the horrendous weapons that threatened all life on land or sea or sky. But Jean and Molly argued endlessly too. A trip to New York City revealed his indifference to real art like painting and sculpture. He hated to be in the endless photos she took of everything. Meanwhile, he couldn't believe she was so quick to sneer at the bands, taking risks and breaking new ground. They had been on other dates, but this one felt special. On the pond, people swooped, trailing the white memory of their breath, laughing and shouting as they bumped into each other. Some walked on the ice like newborn foals. Molly saw a teenager take a tumble and heard a so-called friend cheer. Jean was all legs and arms, so skating might be embarrassing. I haven't done this for years, Molly said, taking a few hobbled steps to the edge. He held her hand so she could step safely onto the ice. Like riding a bike, you couldn't forget. Then he zigged and zagged away, competent and picking up speed. And she accepted the dare, beginning the chase and gaining confidence as her body remembered. How different his movements were now. Even when he was showing off, she forgave him. He grinned as he caught up. The creek behind the farm froze every year. She thought, a man who can skate can learn to dance. Above them, the moon was almost full, hallowed with ice. Soon she'd taste his mouth and he'd taste hers, familiar and exciting all at once. Out on the pond, a dark-haired mother was helping a little girl of perhaps 6. The woman held the girl's hands in hers, her face shining with encouragement. The girl looked down at her feet and up at her mother, hope balanced. Molly wished she'd brought her camera to capture the moment. Jean smiled. He often smiled at children. He wanted a family too. Already, something burned in her heart. Please, please, please.
Okay, thanks a lot. That was great. So thank you for doing this. And, I hope it goes from success to success. Anyhow, we'll end this webinar now.